My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sankaran, Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. I'm going to continue on Mahan's teachings on the different schools of thought. And here I want to, cover the stages of Gnana or wisdom knowledge as described by Mahan. And in the previous, satsangs, we talked about the Dvaita and Advaita teachings. And in that Dvaita teaching, we saw different frameworks and models to explain the inner substratum, both the internal and the external substratum. And the last satsang I spoke about the wave ocean model, where the question is that are the waves separate from the ocean, and why is it that when we are in the surface we get we experience the waves, but as we go deeper the waves dissipate and disappear, and we get a sense of serenity, a sense of calmness, a sense of coolness. In that calmness and coolness we get a sense of clarity. In that clarity we have a better understanding of the forces that are within all of us. And as we progress further, we acquire the knowledge to master that forces, and ultimately we realize that we are that force. So there is an evolution that takes place in our mind, that from that turbulent mind to a more powerful and more expanded and more universal mind. And in this context, Swamiji speaks about the evolution of our jnana, our wisdom knowledge. And this is really important because, ultimately, what gives us the state of our, existence or the quality of our life depends very much on the knowledge, the wisdom knowledge that we acquire to understand the different changes and the changing and the unchanging substratum. So today we are going to speak about the different types of, the stages of the wisdom knowledge, and how is it that, we are able to acquire, more deeper and wider knowledge, and why is it that sometimes that we are unable to understand things, and how do we ensure that we have a sustained, set of, sustained approach to expand the knowledge base and continuously expand it so that we have a better understanding of who we are. So in this context, I want to touch on Mahan's, description of Gnana. So here, Swamiji talks about the evolution of the human mind. And I call this the wow mindset, a mindset that is continuously evolving, continuously, wisdom, that gives us the an outstanding and a winnable mind. So here, the wow stands for, world class. World class means standing out in terms of excellence. We sometimes call sarvadakshina. That means, par excellence in terms of, how the mind operates, how it, acquires the information and knowledge, and transform this knowledge into something that is, creative, innovative, and also, out of the world in terms of leading, in how we think. And also the O is actually outstanding, or, in this context, being able to, outreach and also be able to create opportunity, not for, the knowledge that you acquire, the wisdom knowledge is able to provide opportunities for new learning for yourself, and also provide opportunities for others to learn. And the last one is that the knowledge that we acquire, the last W is that the knowledge we acquire is winnable. Winnable means it's able to essentially, help us succeed in overcoming our ignorance, succeed in enabling us to understand the world that we are living in, uh, enable us to overcome the turbulence, transform the turbulence into more serene, calm, cool, mindset. And also the winnable, mindset is also a mindset that is able to, um, you know, ensure that, the mind is sustained no matter what the circumstances and the situations. So this is the mindset that Swamiji talks about, a wow mindset, this mindset that evolves continuously. So here I want to talk about the Mahan's perspective of what that wisdom knowledge is. He speaks about, in all the, both in the wisdom knowledge one acquires from the Dvaitva or Advaitva, or for that matter, to be able to understand the things around us better. He talks about the 6 stages of evolution. The first one is actually seeking knowledge. And I think this is very important. If one wants to live a enlightened life, if one wants to live a productive life, one needs to be a lover of knowledge, right? And one needs to seek this knowledge. And this is why we see in a lot of the scriptures, it talks about the seeker quality, seeking this knowledge, but many people don't seek that knowledge. They just expect the knowledge to appear. Here, Swamiji says that if you want to acquire the knowledge, you need to seek it, and through that seeking, one not only seeks the knowledge, but also one follows it. That means you ensure that what you have, you're looking for, you have got it. You've got to understand it. You've got to follow it diligently, the instructions and so on, very, very carefully. When we follow it, with a lot of bhakti and a lot of intensity, we see that our learning expands. So if we want to understand, for that matter, what, holds all the planets together, one needs to seek what are the forces that is keeping this together, and try to, understand, try to follow the principles behind, this phenomena. And through that, following intensively, as Swami says, oh, true, no, one starts learning. And, you learn about the characteristics of the principle, how they interrelate. And once you have a understanding, once you have that understanding of the basic principles, you see that, you are able to put in context how they interrelate and how one can, put this to practice in their day-to-day life, and how it impacts, whatever they do. And if they took a particular decision, then the question then is that, what would the outcomes be? So we see that understanding leads to, deciding, better decision-making process. So the decision-making process then enables us to realize the outcomes, whether we achieve the outcomes or not. And if we achieve the outcomes, great. What we have sought for has led to the objective that we were intending to achieve. But if it did not lead to the outcomes, then one goes back to seeking. What is it that I missed out? And that process of, going back again to seek that knowledge, that process of continuing seeking, following, understanding, learning, understanding, deciding, and realizing is a continuous process. And this is where we see in this process of Dvaitva, that process of searching, seeking God's grace, following it intensively, learning about the forces, understanding, and then deciding, okay, how do I, conduct, my way of life, the type of things that I think about, the type of decisions that I make, the type of outcomes that I get, and that continuous process takes place. So it starts off with the seeker. So Swamiji then says that, seeking and following and understanding is a longer term process, because sometimes you're not sure what you're looking for. And this is where sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes you stumble, sometimes you are lucky that a guru appears or a master appears to show you the way, as we saw in the case of Mahan, when he was searching for this inner, the God conscious state. He was searching everywhere in all the scriptures, until one fine day someone showed the inner gate to that inner cosmos. So we see that this is not a one-off. It is a longer term process of seeking, following, and understanding. That is a continuous process. And learning, we see that learning is much more shorter term, as Swamiji says, because we learn many things, and sometimes we learn things that are contemporary, and sometimes it is more eternal, takes a longer time. So the learning, we learn things, and that could be done quite easily. But he says that the realization is instantaneous. Whatever we do, we need to be aware of it. That awareness needs to be there, and that awareness is linked to our learnings. We correlate with all the things that we learn. Is it right or wrong? So there's continuously, we have postulation and hypothesis in our mind, and we validate it through our learning, understanding, putting it to practice, revising it, refining it, and ultimately we come to a state of generating the thoughts and the knowledge to be able to understand this thing called reality or life. So this process is a continuous process, and one needs to think intensively, introspect intensively. And this is what we see a lot of seekers have done, in both the Dvaitva and the Advaitva. They were seekers that continuously continued this process. And Swamiji then talks about the different types of approaches that are used. The first one is what we call Sariya. Sariya is actually devotional practices, altruistic approaches, charity, and all those things that people do to be able to understand this Gnana. So Sariya is actually, instilling discipline, instilling that notion of giving back, getting rid of all the selfish qualities. So the first part is the discipline part, and the part of expanding from one's own selfish nature to be able to become more and more universal. So this is the first part that many of us start off with. The second one is Kriya, which is actually religious rituals and worship of God. So this is all the ritualistic things that we do, to be able to characterize God in different forms and in different things. And we have, prayers and mantras and others to again instill discipline in our mind, but also to be able to think about God. 24 hours, 8 hours, 6 to 8 hours we sleep. The remaining waking hours, we are caught up with our work, our family, and everything else. Sometimes we don't have time to think about the forces that govern us, the forces within us. So we see that the Kriya approach is the ritualistic approach to, have an, characterization of forces that are far greater than us, that animates us, that's part of us. So we have religious rituals, we have worship of God, we have prayers, and so on. So this is another form of knowledge that one acquires. The third aspect is yoga. Yoga, you've got both the, yoga to ensure that the body is healthy, ensure that the body is able to generate and understand and be aware of the forces within itself. Various asanas are put in place. People practice various asanas that put pressure on certain muscles and forces within the body to unlock important forces that could give one the awareness of transforming the potential force into kinetic forces, and that channels vibrations in all of us. So the yoga asanas, different asanas, unlocks different forces within us, gives us, greater awareness of certain forces within us, and also keeps the body healthy so that, our nerves and our blood flow and, the energy flow is fairly harmonized and strong. So that gives us better understanding of our physical, biological form. And when the body is healthy, the mind also is healthy. So we see that, yoga, the various asanas are used to, strengthen our body and our mind. It also enables us to overcome, pressures. You see that sometimes yoga, physical yoga, helps us to burn our calorie, helps us to get rid of toxins and so on. Another aspect of yoga is also contemplative practices. So this is the meditational part, which is, enable us to slowly step away from the external world to a more internal, to focus on the forces within us, help the mind anchor on the forces within us. And slowly, slowly, the mind that is very noisy becomes more and more calmer, more and more focused. So it gives us greater strength to the mind. It gives greater sharpness to the intellect. And this leads to the next phase of development, which is actually jnana. When the body is healthy, when the mind is healthy, when the intellect is sharp, when the bandwidth starts expanding, when all your neural connectivity is firing very well, harmonized, strengthened, when the neural connectivity in the brain is deepened and widened, we see that the next phase is much more easier because now the bandwidth is there for you to experience the things, your thoughts, to be able to understand the thoughts, to be able to decipher the thoughts, to be able to expand the thought, and to be able to acquire that experiential knowledge. Is what Swamiji says, Arivin Arival. So the first three parts, you know, gives you a much more disciplined, stronger body, mind and so on. But it will not lead to enlightenment. Enlightenment comes only in the fourth stage when one acquires the knowledge of this experiential knowledge that is transcendental through the acquisition of jnana. So in all scriptures, in many scriptures, it talks about this vichara component that gives the experiential learning. As long as one has the theoretical knowledge, one will not acquire, will not understand and experience this transcendental, universal state of one's existence. So this jnana part is very important. So, and Swamiji also says, Arivin, Arival, Arivin, Telive. I mean, through this experiential knowledge, one gets the clarity. The Telividam, Telivai, Tendada Jnanam. He says that through this clarity, one acquires this wisdom knowledge. And that wisdom knowledge is nothing but one's own vibration in this material world that emanates from that formless, dimensionless, universal substratum, which many people call God and so on. So this evolution or this different practices are there. Ultimately, jnana is that which gives one that enlightened. So here says that, the path to enlightened living comes through the acquisition of this jnana. And this is where it brings us to the next stage of all the things that, how does one then acquire that jnana? And this is the part that is really important, that the jnana part, gives you that experiential learning, but how does one get that experiential learning? And this is where Swamiji says, you've got to think, thinking, one needs to think really, intensively on how is the thoughts generated? How do I understand the thoughts? How do I stop the thoughts and explore the thoughts? And how do I magnify the thoughts? How do I dissolve the thoughts? How do I integrate the thoughts? How do I generate any thoughts? How do I become the master of my thoughts? So the thinking process one needs to really, go through. You see, we as a scientists, if they want to discover a virus or a bacteria or something really minute, they put that through the specimen under the microscope and refine, continuously tune it to be able to see it. The same thing, we use electron microscope. In that same way, we see the telescopes are used, and there's continuous tuning to be able to make sense of this faint light. And the faint light, if you tune it properly, would be an amazing and huge galaxy, or a solar system, and so on. So we see that thinking process enables us to sharpen our mind, understanding where the thoughts come from. So at the micro level, we use microscope. At the macro level, we use telescope. But if we want to explore our thoughts and our thinking process, one needs to acquire that inner scope. And this is where this introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, and Mahan's Kundalini meditation is really important, because it enables the mind to become that inner scope, like how the telescope and the microscope. So the thinking process is the refinement that takes place in the mind to continuously tune, so that the most subtlest frequency is be able to cognize, or the most subtlest bacteria or virus, or micro level things could be cognized. In the same way, the most faintest light could be given, one can understand that. So that thinking process is a continuous refinement that takes place, and the refinement requires one to be able to understand every thought, to be able to explore every thought, and to be able to see why the thought is there, how the thought is there, and how do one master the thought. And that helps, understanding that our own thinking process is really critical. And this is the whole perspective of this meditational yoga, whatever we call it, is to be able to understand the thinker. If we understand the thinker, then all the thoughts and the thinking process is trivial. The second aspect Swamiji talks about is that if we master that, then the concentration becomes much more better. We become more concentrated in our thinking, like the light that is, focused. You have a lot of light that's dissipating. So here, a mind that is concentrated is able to focus onto that which is really important, and that which is not important, it dissipates or integrates it. So we see that concentration improves. When your concentration improves, the ability to understand, the ability to, cognize becomes much better. So this is why every morning, this meditation, the spending quiet time is very important. So when the concentration improves, then you see that there's an intuition. One is able to understand, cognize, be aware of it. So for me, intuition also means into your own vision, right? So the inner vision that we have, the inner lens that we have, that gives us a better understanding of the things around us and the things within us. So we see that naturally leads us to understanding, and finally, the realization of who we are. So there is an evolution that takes place in the human mind as we go through this process. And finally, the mind becomes very refined, like the Hamsa, unperturbed by anything outside, but closely anchored on that inner substratum. So when this happens, we see that, we have a better understanding of who we are. We're able to go deep down within us and touch the core or the force within ourselves. And this is what, we saw in the wave ocean model, that as long as we are in the surface, we are impacted by things in the surface. But to make the descent deeper into, many people find it really hard. When I tell disciples, you've got to, unarva gavani, or, focus within you, they find it very difficult. They say, it's hard for me to be quiet, right? To get that quietude in us. And this is what the practicing is very important. The practice of, observing the thoughts that is running in your mind without interacting with it, taking each thought one by one, trying to understand where it comes from, and slowly, that as we understand these thoughts, it dissipates. And ultimately, you see that the flow of thoughts starts, gaps forming, and in the gaps between the gaps, you see that you have, glimpses of that universal state. And ultimately, eventually, the gaps get wider and wider. And finally, there comes a stage where, the thoughts just, is not there. You're just who you are. So this is exactly what happens in this wave ocean model as we go deeper and deeper through this practice. Ultimately, one touches that universal truth or the force within all of us. Now, the question then is that, as long as we are in the surface, we are impacted by it. And in the last satsang, I spoke about what are the causes of this turbulence in us. I spoke about, as long as we are in that state of, the surface, we are always impacted by the force. And this is where we see that we're able to relate what nature is out there. And we are part of the nature. Whatever nature, the learnings and the forces that are embedded in nature is also in us. Whatever the turbulence that, we see on the ocean surface also impacts us. And this is where the parallels that we can draw. So we see in that ocean, we have winds of materiality, and there's a lot of turbulence. I spoke about how that is driven by desires. We have pressures, that, we experience, challenges, some of it is man-made. Others is around people that we associate with, the gravitational pull, and the last one is that I spoke about how sometimes as part of our material experience, we have major changes that happens, disturbances that are major calamities that changes our course of our lives. Sometimes it could be, suddenly you win a prize, a huge prize money that changes our course of our lives. So that is on the positive side, but sometimes we experience very major calamities that completely disrupts us. So this is something that happens in nature, and it also happens in all of us. And I spoke about, someone asked me, Guru, this is great. We understand this, but, how do we actually do this? So I want to spend some time today on what does nature have to teach us? What does the ocean have to teach us? And this is where we're going to use our Gnana. It's how we learn from nature, the forces that impacts, one another, and how the calm and serenity is generated. In that same way, we're going to use our Gnana to say, okay, how do we address this? So I want to spend time today on how do we divinize our desires. We see that desires causes a lot of winds of materiality or turbulence. How do we then, transform those desires that creates a lot of the waves into sublimity? And how do we, so here are some examples, and I'll show you later on more serious examples. So here, so for example, let's take, we have this a particular desire for something, and let's take the desire of getting our education, right, or getting our studies, and oftentimes when we ask students, what is it that you want to study, and they say, well, I want to be an engineer, a doctor, or do medicine, and which is great. It's a desire, it's an ambition, right? So, and when we ask them, why is it that you want to do this particular study? They say, well, I want to make money. I want to be famous. I want to be this. I want to be that, and so on, which is okay. And sometimes you achieve it, and many times we don't achieve it, right? So I'll give you one example where someone wanted to be a medical doctor, and there was a lot of pressure from family because there was a lot of doctors in the family. And the desire is to become a doctor because the person then can, of course, being a doctor, being a surgeon, you make a lot of money, there's prestige, and so on. And the pressure was enormous, siblings, many of them were doctors, parents. and a lot of challenges, and a lot of pressure, and the person did not get into medical school, and of course a lot of disappointment, a lot of pressure from ridicule, and so on. But what is really interesting is that this person then completely crumbled, and ended up doing veterinary medicine, going to Bangladesh, and they did not get into the university that they wanted, and ended up doing something very different. And of course, when they came back, many people ridicule him, say, "Oh, you're an animal doctor," and this and that, and of course he was very disappointed, at the point of even contemplated suicide. And I remember very clearly that he came to speak to my father. This is in the 70s. And that is a time when the center was just established. And my father counseled him, and he says, "It's okay, I mean, at least you've got an education, but why don't you do something with it? You may not be a medical doctor, but you can contribute to what you wanted to do, which is essentially to contribute to humanity." And I remember he got initiated, in his 20s. And eventually, what happened was that he went on to do a Master of Public Health, and went on to do his PhD in John Hopkins in medical microbiology, and he became a specialist in infectious diseases, and became a amazing scientist that discovered many, many things. And he always thanked my father for it. He says that, while I did not become a medical doctor, through the knowledge that I got from Mahan's teachings and divinizing my desires that I wanted, uh, I now have discovered new things that the medical doctors use it. So we see that, sometimes, we don't get what we want, and most people get disappointed. But how do we divinize this, take these lessons, this scars as a foundation for new learning and new path to chart? And I remember a passage which Abdul Kalam mentioned, that, when somebody says no, it means, it doesn't mean that it stops there. No means next opportunity, right? Or new opportunities. And this is what divinizing the desires that one has. So here we see that, how do we transform the pressures that we have in our lives into treasures? And this is where one asks the question, look, we've got to count our blessings. This is what we have. As long as we are breathing, we have to, count our blessings. And how do we use the experiences as a foundation for learning? So this is one example. There are other examples where we see that, we crave for certain things, we have ambitions, but, sometimes when we don't use that jnana, the ambitions dissipates, right? So as what I mentioned, we have this dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. We've got to acquire the knowledge that enables us to use, it effectively on, and harness the potential that we have, so that we transform the potential into infinite possibilities. So here is this is an example. The other aspect is that, many people, don't appreciate what they have, right? And always crave for other people's lives. When we look at other people's lives and praise for other people's life, we miss out the opportunities that we have. So, divinize, the opportunities that we have, uh, whether it's education, our parents, our relationships. How do we, harness our relationships? Sometimes we see that, we are very critical of the people that support us, that live with us, that are part and parcel of our lives. And oftentimes we focus so much on the negative and the frictions, as opposed to harnessing that relationships so that it becomes more and more harmonious. Sometimes we may have very simple jobs, and people crave for other people's jobs or other people's lives. How do we, when we focus on our own, career and jobs, we see that we learn more, we enrich more, and suddenly we start seeing that, we start progressing. So put everything that you are experiencing under the scrutiny of this wisdom, this jnana. And you see that when you breathe that jnana into those thoughts and this experience, you start seeing them bloom. Like how this person in the 1970s gave up hope, but today became one of the best research scientists. The same thing, we may think that we have a simple life, simple job, or when we use the jnana, we see that it becomes an amazing platform for our own learning. So again, we see that part of this jnana is to observe everything that it passes through our mind, and every action, we divinize it, whether from waking up in the morning, brushing our teeth, having our bath. We have our bath. I give you another simple example. We have our bath, and sometimes we're just washing the body, but when we are having the bath, observe the first drop of water that touches your head. And you see that if you observe with that Utru Trunoka, the first drop of water that touches here will give you that amazing exhilaration and that inner vibration. The same thing when we eat our food, we are so focused on the TV or other things, we miss that beautiful taste, that the beautiful melody of that dance on our tongue, that we don't appreciate the taste and the awesome taste of the food. The same thing, we are in relationships, we're so focused on other things that we dissipate, that we miss that melody and that vibration in our own relationships. The same thing with jobs, the same thing with community work, the same thing with our jobs. Most people say, well, I'm earning a salary, I work for a salary. I'm sorry, if you do that, I think life is really boring, right? But if you take your job as, something that is, in a very divine way, we see that, your job becomes not a job. I always tell people, I don't have a job. I have a hobby that pays me really well. So you see that the transformation takes place and you really appreciate what you do, and it's not a chore. And this is how that divinizing one's own desires. This is what the dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. So here again, if you see that, you see the turbulence, that one experiences, as I mentioned earlier, we see that the water, yes, in the surface, the sun is going to evaporate the water. There's a lot of, transformation that takes place. In the same way, when we're in the surface, we are going to experience challenges. Like the water that, expands and becomes a vapor and becomes a cloud and eventually ends up in the rivers and comes back to the ocean. Yes, we go through all those change, but the water is still a water. So the same way, the mind that is enlightened, so yes, I go through all those things, but I don't change. The form may change, but I don't change. And the beautiful part is that I get to transition, to evaporate, to become a cloud, be part of that mountains, come through the river and back to the ocean. And I've gone through this journey, experiencing different things, but I have not changed. So again, in that same way, an enlightened person says, yes, I have gone through exuberance and happiness and also challenges, but yet, I've experienced all this, I've learned from all this, but I have not changed. So this is the type of mindset that one gets, that this is what we call a dharmic mind. And the same thing as we see that, as I said, precious become treasures, right? And scarce become stars, and impossible becomes I am possible. So again, we see that, our own behavior starts changing. We start modifying our behavior from that gross to the roughness to a more graceful, thoughts that generates speech and behavior. And we see that when we start doing that, the people that associate around us with us starts transforming. Either they start changing if they were very negative, and through our presence they start changing, or they move on, and you see that your own orbit starts transforming. You start being among people who are positive, a can-do attitude, and so on. And ultimately, all this leads us to, even though there may be structural changes that are ahead of us, we become the master of those forces. As how we have, tsunami and earthquakes and all, we take it with beautiful stride, say this too is something part and parcel of me, part and, it comes from me, it sustains in me and it dissolves in me. So it's like, as I say, the epicenter of everything starts and ends with us. Epicenter of all goodness starts and ends with us, and the epicenter of all negativity also starts and ends with us. So we see that, the best, as what Swamiji says, that no true noka is actually observe your mind very carefully, observe every thought very carefully, divinize every thought very carefully. The most simplest, the most subtlest, right up to the most, important and, thoughts that we use in our day-to-day lives. So we see that, this is part and parcel of Gnana. I've given you a kind of an overview of how one, transitions from that surface. Even at the surface level, we see that it comes back to that ocean. A more important thing, I've covered this. So the spiritual compass is really, now let's come back to these more, harsher thoughts that we carry, many of us carry. And I've covered this, how this mindset of this Gnana helps us, as the spiritual compass, that yes, from time to time, we have things that we hate, through this introspective and Gnana processes, we start flipping back, of why this hate is. So we expand, we understand why this hate is coming from, how this hate, and slowly, what we see is that hate transforms into reconciliation. It leads to the self-introspection. The problem is not with other people, the problem is with me, because I am the master of my own thoughts and my own experiences. And slowly, we see that, this thought of hate transforms into something far more greater and more expanded. You have a sense of compassion, kindness, gentleness, and we see that, hatred slowly disappears. And we also covered, other things of laziness. Sometimes you feel lazy, don't feel like doing things, and sometimes there are days that I don't feel like doing anything. It seems to be lazy, but actually what you do is that you are regenerating yourself, and you transform that. Okay, how do I rest my mind and my body and my intellect to come back with much more stronger? But again, through introspection, one understands, why do I feel lethargic? And that introspection leads us to going to the underpinning of why this is happening. And this is part and parcel of the Gnana. And you understand that why this happens and what are the things that you need to do to break away from this laziness and, lethargy. And we see that this is part and parcel of the Gnana, of the transformation that takes place. The introspection leads to Gnana, better way of living. We transform ourselves into having, better, more illumined life, and ultimately attaining the Paranjoti life. The same thing with jealousy, we covered, where, again, a thought of jealousy, how do we transform that? It's often the jealousy comes because we're insecure of our own self. But when you practice introspection, contemplation, reflection, acquire the Gnana, you start seeing, hey, I've got the inner force in me, and slowly we start transforming to believing in yourself, believing in your own potential. You get the confidence. There's no more inferiority or superiority complex. One attains that universal complex. So we see that this spiritual compass, this acquisition of Gnana helps us to, divinize the smallest, the most subtlest, and the most grossest thoughts into more refined and more universal. And again, greed, the same thing. We saw, we see that, this insecurities that causes this. Through Gnana, we become more and more altruistic, we become more and more expanded, we become more and more universal, and we see that we find the richness that we have, that we have the abundance in us that enables us to become more and more universal. So we see that this acquisition of Gnana, as what Swami talks about, enables us to be aware of the inner resource in all of us, and that helps us to power ourselves, helps us to understand ourselves, and helps us to become a greater and more grander and touch that inner core that is far more greater than our gross body. Sandosham. Thank you.